Thanks for tuning in, everyone, to this Train Your Team video about healthy, team-based decision making. It's such an important thing for our teams to be able to make decisions together in a way that makes us stronger as a team and stronger as a church. You know, I'm from North Dakota, and one of the darlings of North Dakota is former President Teddy Roosevelt. Before he became president, he spent some time in North Dakota, and one of the big things of his life before becoming president was fighting in the Spanish-American War. He led a group of soldiers in that battle, and at one particular point in that battle, he decided to charge a hill. He found himself halfway up the hill with bullets flying past his head, riding his horse to victory, only to realize that his team wasn't with him. His soldiers were standing at the bottom of the hill. He had forgotten to tell them what he was doing. He forgot to summon them. He forgot to make a plan with his troops in order to take the hill together. I've been in ministry long enough to know what it feels like to take a hill alone. I also have been blessed enough to know what it feels like to take a hill together, to be able to say, we are a team, we did it, we made a plan, and we accomplished our goals together. There is nothing better than that feeling in ministry, knowing that you didn't charge alone, you didn't charge in separate directions, but you worked together. And today, we're going to talk about 3 specific steps that your team can make every time you try to make important decisions. And hopefully these steps will guide you as you do that. The 3 steps that you're going to be making together is, number 1, define the issue. Number 2, design the process. And number 3, direct the outcome. Let's start with number 1, define the issue. I'm a firm believer that when you're making decisions, you need to start at the top. If you think about it, most church fights, most church problems, most issues that we have in the church are at the bottom, are on the tactical level. You hear that commonly held joke of the church council that argues week in, week out about the color of carpet in the atrium. But it's true in many cases that churches spend a lot of time and a lot of capital arguing, debating, trying to make decisions on that low level, tactical level. And so I believe that it's really important to have the discipline of pushing pause on some of the tactical things that we may feel like we want to just decide and keep moving forward, in order to make sure that we have a strategy guiding the tactics. And as we're talking about the strategy, we also need to push higher to identify whether or not we have a healthy vision and a philosophy for why we're doing. So instead of trying to decide about what time should we have worship services or what style should we use, we want to have a strategy for why we do worship. Maybe the people we're trying to reach would benefit from certain times or styles. But even bigger than that, do we have a philosophy for why we do church that guides our strategy for how we do worship, that helps our decision making in the tactics of worship? Always better to start at the top. And here's a bonus. If you invest your team's time first at the top, you're going to attract higher level leaders. High level leaders need to understand the strategy. They need to understand the philosophy, and it needs to resonate with their mind and their heart so that they can leverage their gifts to be a part of it and help make it happen. Churches that spend all the time on the tactical level attract doers, helpers, or consumers. Churches that spend their time on the strategic and philosophical levels to make sure they have a solid foundation for what they do attract leaders who want to be a part of something so clear and so compelling. So define the issue by starting at the top and then by clarifying one pivotal question. If you ever do couple counseling and you have a couple come in that's all over the place, lots of issues to work through, lots of conflict, you might say, guys, look, we can't work through all 10 of these issues at once. Let's start here. Let's pick one pivotal question that we need to work through in order to take a next step together. Good teams, disciplined teams have a laser-like ability to focus on one pivotal question at a time. So you define the issue by starting at the top and by clarifying, once you have those philosophical pieces in place, what's the question we're going to be deciding on? That's step 1. Step 2, design the process. This is where your team decides who needs to be a part of the process. Who would we regret not having a part of the process once we made the decision? If it's a decision about youth ministry, unless it's related to an issue with the youth director that needs to be decided elsewhere, you're going to want the youth guy there. If it's about worship, you're going to want to include your worship leader or your worship team or people in key positions who are a part of that process. You also need to decide who should not be there. You might have Bob sitting in your atrium every Sunday complaining, or he might be the squeaky wheel you want to grease by including him. But just because someone is vocal in your church doesn't necessarily mean that they should play a role in the decision-making process. Sometimes involving the wrong people makes the decision-making process more cumbersome, more delayed, and more difficult. It's not about involving more and more people around the table. It's identifying the right people that you would regret not having there once a decision has been made, because you need them to help implement that decision. So designing the process involves articulating who should be there and who shouldn't. And then secondly, the how. There's two aspects of how we make decisions that I believe we can clarify on the front end and save ourselves a lot of inefficiency and confusion. Number one, articulate a sequence for making decisions, a decision-making sequence. Now, this is simply a timeline of steps and conversations that you plan to have in order to make this decision. Now, some decisions you just have in the hallway and they're little decisions and they're easy. Some decisions you have in a meeting with your team and it's over. We're talking in this video about higher level, bigger picture decisions that require a sequence of steps to make them. I like to have oftentimes some feedback sessions. I like to have a tentative decision that we get kind of a last call sorts of feedback on, and then finally a final decision, upon which point everybody buys in and moves forward to implement. But I almost don't want to show you a general sequence, because the sequence is best when it's crafted for the calendar of your year and for the issue that it's related to. So take a look at this worship sequence. If we want to talk about worship style or time changes, we want to maybe finalize a decision at a certain time of year that makes sense. So we want to maybe start this new worship process after the new year. So backing up from that, we're going to line up a series of conversations, a series of steps, a series of feedback sessions, maybe a tentative decision that we do. And then we also incorporate prayer into the process. We cast vision throughout the process. Because you've done the work of setting your strategy and your philosophy in place, very important to let that be the thread that holds all the pearls on this string. So you want a decision-making sequence. Equally important is a decision-making spectrum. And that's a fancy way of saying, look, there's a bunch of ways we can make this decision. And maybe everybody on your team thinks differently about how the decision is going to be made. A lot of people come to the table expecting consensus, where we're all going to talk until we all agree. And that usually, on low-level things, that can happen. On higher-level things, it's a little more difficult to trust that everybody's going to agree. As Patrick Lencioni says in his book, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, you've got to make sure that people feel heard in the process so they can be trusted to buy into the decision after you make that decision. So ensure unfettered dialogue, and then clarify an endpoint where you say, okay, guys, now that I've heard you, here's what I'm deciding and why. People are much more likely to buy into decisions if they've been heard in that way. The final end of that spectrum is where the leader decides without input, or the leader has already decided prior to the conversation. And if that's where you are, that's okay. Sometimes in leadership, you need to make a decision, and it really isn't reliant upon the team's feedback. And I just want to encourage you, if that's where you are, if you feel this prophetic, inspired, guys, we've got to go this way. I'm convicted, we got to go this way. Come to the team asking for support for what you've already decided. Don't disguise it as something you're trying to build consensus around. The team will smell that pretty quick. If you got a good team on your hands, they're going to sense that you've already decided and then begin to mistrust the decision-making process that you lay out. So if that's where you are, simply come to the meeting, ask for support, rather than trying to create a false consensus. So you got your who and how, and the how is a decision-making sequence and a decision-making spectrum. That leads us to the final aspect of team-based decision-making, and that's the outcome. You want to direct the outcome. That looks like communicate, then implement. Sometimes we start implementing decisions and we have forgotten to tell people. So people see a new worship schedule, or they see teams functioning differently and they say, what's going on? And then we have to backtrack and explain the decision that's been made. Always better to communicate first. And that's simply who needs to know what we've decided and how do we need to tell them. Make sure that you pay attention to how people in your context communicate. Don't rely on outdated tools like email, which people certainly still use it, but most people don't check email very faithfully, so that can't be your overall strategy. So who needs to know and how? And then who needs to do what to implement the decision and by when? Sometimes we make decisions but don't make a plan to implement them, which undermines the decision-making process. So make sure you clarify whose responsibility is what as we implement this decision. Communicate, then implement. So listen, as I end this video, I want to encourage you in one particular way. Sometimes decision making is painful. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's stressful. And I think it takes a lot of pressure off our teams if we can be upfront on one important truth that comes right from the mouth of Jesus. Jesus said, "He who is faithful in a little will be faithful in much." If your team feels dug in on an issue, if it feels like the decision-making process is clumsy and cumbersome, just hit the pause button and say, "Guys, listen, this decision is not about this decision." Jesus is giving us a little right now, and it feels like a lot. But if we can learn how to make healthy decisions together, if we can learn how to be honest and trust one another, if we can make a decision and implement it well, Jesus is going to know that we can handle more down the road. So this decision is really about the next one. Let's get healthy as a team. Let's not focus on getting our own way. Let's not focus on getting a specific outcome. Let's focus on developing, like a weightlifter, the decision-making muscle that's going to make us more faithful down the road with bigger decisions that Jesus puts in our lap because he knows that we will be faithful. If we're faithful in a little, let's be faithful in a lot. That allows you to look at your team and say, "Guys, whatever we decide here, if we've all been heard, we're going to all buy into it. No one's allowed to undermine the decision-making process once we're done, because we've all trusted the process, been honest throughout, and then we're going to all be responsible for owning the decision as if it were our own. And when God sees that faithfulness, he will trust us with more down the road." Well, I hope this has been helpful to you as your team looks to make healthy, mission-minded decisions in the future. Let us know how it's going. Talk to your ministry coach about how it's going as you try to implement these principles. God bless you guys, and thanks for being a part of the Church Field family.